Hello. It's April 4th. I mean, April 8th, 2018. Hopefully, we have a better rest of the podcast than getting the date wrong. But better than getting the date wrong would indicate. And so here we go. Today, I'm going to talk about overcoming the ego's resistance of truth with true selfless love. That's describing the idea, tunnel vision in the most expansive way possible, using love as your guide. What insights we can take from the Bible. I don't claim to be a Bible expert, but I do see the underlying truth within some of the metaphors and other well-known stories I know of. I am reading through the Bible now because I figure if I'm going to be a spiritual leader, I better read through the whole Bible. So that's what I'm doing. And one of the topics of that are how do mental and emotional investments within the world as it exists. So you have your ego's beliefs, you're rooted into your world, and the fear and threats you feel are to that because you don't know that there is this other way to live, and it's actually not that scary. It's you have there's growing pains, and that's birth pains, literally, and that's actually everything's a metaphor. So that's probably why. That's why birth pains are probably painful, because it is rebirth, and birth is painful at times. It doesn't have to be. There's better ways. That's what we're gonna talk about. And I shouldn't say better ways. I should say ways with coping that inspires you to overcome. And understanding all of this, this is gonna be a theme throughout, is putting it all in the context of history. And this isn't the first time societal changes have happened. And if you're not within the dogmatic perspective of science and dogmatic perspectives of religion, where they try to force interpretations out of religious texts, and they're not reading the Bible, they're just looking for what they want to find, and there it is. And we all do that in our lives. We confirmation bias, it's not just a thing that happens when some people are being irrational. It's fundamental to perception itself, and breaking that down is going to be important for you in the coming transitions. People are going to be like, I get that. Me saying a collapse, like, I'm not saying that. It's just what's going to happen. And don't get afraid, though. It's forcing you towards love, and that's the point. And now I'm going to talk about how feminism is one of the motifs that happens during these periods, and it's the ones I know of are Babylon, the Roman Empire collapse, and now it's happening now. And that's not the rise of feminism during each of those periods is not some random occurrence. It's part of the underlying structure of reality, and reality is consciousness. It's the one mind, and because it's the one mind, it follows these patterns that are so consistent that in beyond chance that it wouldn't seem possible if we were just looking at a scientific materialist perspective that the ego takes for granted. And that's that. And yeah, so looking at that. So first, I'm really your questions are going to be valuable for this whole project and movement, because I need your perspective. I understand, because I went through this. I went as part of me being this person who does this. I went from the perspective you believe. I started from, I'm a PhD student in neuroscience, and I was studying the brain and how the brain, with under the assumption that consciousness arises from physical matter. And I know that. I know the transition from going to that world to a spiritual world. And I can help you with that, and I'm going to try to help you with that, but I'll be much more effective at that if you submit your questions and comments. And links to socials are in the show notes. And because we're just manifesting stuff here, the person I'm working with, Kevin Rice, ran into someone who makes documentaries, and that looks like it's going to happen. So that's good. And I have a whole plan for changing the world here that involves you guys. I don't have the plan. I'll say God has the plan, and I'm doing my best to understand what he's communicating to me. And luckily, in my supernatural experience, it involved writing out information from the unconscious. Just, I got my head out of the way, my ego out of the way, and I was just, you can imagine, just writing blindfolded, just letting it go. And in that, I knew this whole time is just me knowing the next two steps. And I know the next two steps. And the next steps are establishing a podcast, and then interviewing guests on my podcast. So then you get in the podcasting realm of going on shows and having people on your shows. And then in that process, people will see I'm not crazy. That's an obstacle here of the ego. And I'll talk about that. And that I am serious. And being a prophet is anything that you couldn't do. Anyone could. By definition, a prophet is someone who communicates a message from God. All I did was remember that my life, that I was born here to communicate a message. And I covered that in the podcast, this episode 2. I simply remembered why my initial interest from when I was 4 years old was to be a mailman. And I didn't know why I wanted to be a mailman, because I was afraid of talking and I was afraid of reading, and I didn't think I would ever be able to read. And then, well, don't use your ego bias to judge my whole reasoning about why I know without listening to that episode, because I did describe that, and you can read the document that's describes, it's turned out to be a book. It's 70 pages long. What happened. And yeah, it's just obvious that me being this person who communicates this message, and there's other people. I'm not saying that I'm the only spiritual awoke person. Awoke. See, there's my fear of reading. Awoke. No, I just have my purpose, and that's me having been a scientist who kind of in the dark found God through science, because we're on this grand hero's journey in which we do come full circle. And there's so much to say. Okay, I'm going to describe the full circle part later when I talk about the rise of feminism and what that has to say about now. And could you believe that I was a shy person who couldn't talk to people, and now I'm communicating a message without any fear? And that's the power of love, for you right there. And that's the whole purpose of love. And I talked about that before, but in the last couple episodes. Okay, but today I'm going to focus on the ego's resistance of truth. So, what your brain does and your ego does is it adapts to the environment. And it adapts and stabilizes. It's trying to create a homeostasis with your environment. It has things how they are. That's how you're safe now, and it just keeps you safe. It keeps a static environment where in our animals have the same thing, but our environments are more complex, and our environments includes having a job, going to high school, you're going to college, you have interactions with coworkers, you have a family and you have kids and you have all these obligations and bills, and you got organizations you're a part of, and you got friends, and all of that is part of what is the ego tries to maintain homeostasis. So you can imagine that anything that there's just an infinite amount of things that could potentially affect that. And I have this graph on the screen describing what I'm talking about. So imagine you have your source energy, and what I'm describing here, well, it's not going to be an exact description of how it actually works. It is a good way to conceptualize how it actually works. And all we have is our mental models, and I call this awakening conceptualization tools. And these conceptualization tools are how you make this abstract knowledge, because we're talking about eternal and infinite, and we live in a finite, time sensitive environment, and that's just there's such a vast, they're opposites of each other. We're talking about knowledge that is inherently opposite. So our best way to talk about that is we have these ways to conceptualize it. And the actual way it works could be something, it's not this, but this is a good way to conceptualize it. So imagine you have yourself, your true self. You can call it God, you can call it truth, love. Love is a good way to describe it. Pure life. Love is life. So it's a prism. So what a prism does, it differentiates a beam of white light into many colors. And so if you imagine your pure self is the white light, and then it hits your brain is the prism, and then that creates a reality of all this experience. So imagine there's a certain thickness to the prism, and the prism goes from left to right. Picture this in your head, and the light comes in from the left. So on the left side of the prism is your core beliefs. Your core beliefs are just, it's fundamental to reality. Those on the opposite side of the prism, on the far right side of the prism, you have your thoughts, your very surface level thoughts. And those include ruminating thoughts. And one of the symptoms of depression are ruminating thoughts. And ruminating thoughts are when you think about the world, but you're trying to think through problems, but you're not actually. You're just making it worse, and nothing changes. You're still just at the mercy of your more core beliefs. Near to the left of ruminating thoughts, closer to core, you have culture, because you're a person that arises from the culture, and then the culture we're in gives rise to politics and ideology, and the less core, the left versus right debate. So the left versus right debate is inherently insane, because when you're caught in it, and when you are a person who, if you think that, and don't take offense to this, because this is about you waking up, and I'm just trying to wake you up, and you will realize that once you wake up that I'm actually helping you. So so if you're a person, let's say you are a Republican, and you're a Republican who just thinks that, wow, the Democrats are so ruining all of this. If they would just do what we thought, then everything would change and we'd be all fine. And you're a Democrat. Of course, if you're a Democrat now, you obviously hate Donald Trump. But, and I'm not saying Donald Trump is good. Donald Trump arose from a culture. He's a symptom. He's not a good president, but he's a symptom, not the cause of our problems. So you're a Democrat, and you're just like, oh, the Republicans, they have control over the House, and they have the president. They're going to run this country into the ground, and I'm going to be left to deal with it all, and my life is screwed. And that mindset is the mindset that creates all the problems. Because the truth is that as long as we're thinking like that, nothing's going to get better. And pushing the problems to a less core, less fundamental, that's a defense mechanism of the ego. Because the ego is just trying to maintain, and it knows that altering something that's more that's closer to source affects everything that comes after it. Because if the laser of light is coming into the prism, what comes first affects everything that comes after. And that's exactly how it works. And at the core, I gave some examples, is ESP. ESP is something that is very clear exists, but it's ignored by science because it throws everything that science is based on into question. And because it throws everything into question, and it's more core, closer to the mysterious eternal, because ESP inherently suggests that we're all one. That fits into the paradigm of ESP, that mind is more fundamental to reality. That fits into ESP. But science like neuroscience, which I'm from, I am a neuroscientist, the assumption it rests upon that consciousness is more primary to subjective experience. I mean, I got that wrong. The brain is more primary to subjective experience, in that the brain gives rise to it, but that's not the case. And that's what ESP shows. And I mean, it just makes sense. I'll go into that more. So that's why science ignores it and is threatened by it, because it then tries to, and that then demonstrates the fact that there's a missing piece of the puzzle, and in our egos like to think we have all the pieces, and that there's nothing else we need to know. We got it all figured out. And anything that threat to that is treated as, like, for example, it's crazy, and it's really the opposite. So, for example, I call myself a prophet because I am communicating a message of God, and I remembered I'm here for some kind of purpose. And I'm not trying to separate myself, not make myself better because I know we're all equal, but just that idea is going to be a reason people use to try to say this is crazy without ever actually, well, they will at some point, but without trying to understand it. And it's just fear of truth. We have a fear of something that alters our more core beliefs. That's just a law of how our brains work. You're not afraid. You're not thinking anything is insane. You're just thinking it's your ego just knows that integrating that information necessitates an alteration of your entire life. And that's what the ego does. It's just what it does. So in this picture I have diagramming this, I have organized religion and science kind of on the same level as ego maintenance. Organized religion and science both have their dogma, and organized religion has their dogma in that it doesn't it reads the religious text and it looks to support a paradigm. Something like the Bible is such a, first of all, Jesus did not write it. It's just obviously over the course of time, dogma and people's egos wrote on used it to support itself. And that's not to say anything, not to talk against, it's just inherent within the culture. I'm not talking against anyone. But if you can get past that, if you can just look at the meaning of what is said and understand it in its correct metaphor of the mind context, it's amazing. You can find enlightenment through what's said there, but that's not how it happens, because we're not trying to consciously find enlightenment. We're trying to maintain the world as it exists now. And there's a good quote here. Wait. Hold on. It's the Gospel of Luke. As I'm starting to read through the Bible, it describes how different people are receptive to a message of love from God at different levels. Okay, so the seed is the word of God. So you're dropping a seed into the ground. Those by the wayside stand for those who have heard, and then the devil comes and takes the word from their hearts so that they may not believe and be saved. So you drop the seed and it just goes off and it never germinates. Wait, I don't want to make a mistake. Quoting the Bible, those takes the word from their hearts. Okay, so the word is taken from the heart, and that means you're not integrating it. But that's not the part I was even reading this portion for. Okay, those on the rocky ground stand for those whoever they hear the word gladly receive it, but they do not take root. So if you have rocky ground, you can imagine you drop a seed on, it doesn't take root. That's this truth being deflected by the ego because they're not ready to give up those core beliefs yet. And the seed that falls among thorns stands for those who, when they have heard, go their way and are suffocated by the cares, the wealth, and the pleasures of life, and so never complete their craft. So that's like, you hear the word, but you're so engrossed within the world as you know it, and you can't imagine incorporating it and integrating it into your life because you don't, maybe you have a job, you don't know, it's not, you don't know how to alter it, and you don't know, have the wherewithal to think that you can accept this knowledge and still be happy and doing what you do. And there's not the perspective of how to practically make that transition into a reality in which you are following your heart. And that's what I started with Align You, as practical ways to go about. Essentially, I'm not telling anyone with a family to quit their job and go chase some wild goose chase, but a practical way. What can you do to integrate your passions into your life? How can you, maybe you start a blog and you just start talking about it, and maybe you want to get a new job and you set up a 2-year plan to where you're going to prepare for making the transition, and then over the course of the next year you start applying. Like, this isn't, we're going to be practical about this. It's practical, it's mind and heart. So the third one, the seed that falls, the seed that is in good ground stands for those who have heard the word and keep hold of it in a heart that is fine and good and bear fruit. So that's the seed dropping into good fertile ground. And being receptive, the good seed falling into a ground where it grows and takes root and blossoms over time, that has nothing to do with your wealth, it has nothing to do with, it has something to do with the past, but theoretically you can have whatever past, it doesn't matter. This is only about you being able to integrate information into your life, letting the seed grow and germinate and then take root and let it blossom. Because the ego is very short-sighted. It's the love in true self is internal, it's infinite, and the ego is abundant. The ego is lacking in scarcity. And the true self is okay with saying, okay, we have this piece of information on spirituality. Okay, the true self is a real thing, and it is really about me completing this grand hero's journey and going back to eternal bliss. So it makes sense to make the sacrifice in the present to get to that, because this is just a blip in the radar. And ultimately, I'm just going to keep repeating this lesson anyways, and this lesson in life, and the lessons of life, and a more broad hero's journey, and the lessons of it within your life. And love is just trying to get you back to love. And if you can listen to this and hear the truth in it and let that seed grow, let it take root, and it'll be a process, but you can get there. You just need to be a ground that's receptive, because this is going to be all truth. And there's lots of other people who describe spirituality. The two I'm listen to on YouTube is Kevin Rice, the person I work with, and Michael Murdad. They're just honest, and they get it, and can help you along with me make that transition into a life of less fear, and you're rooted in love. And together we will do that. And now I'm going to go into the topic that it's really my kind of got this led me to figuring out the big picture. Okay. This is so we got past, I'll recap, emotional investments in your ego-based world. It's tough, it's painful when they die. And when they die, there's an archetype that represents this transformation. And that is the archetype that is presenting itself on a collective level right now. And that is the mother. The mother is the source of rebirth. And in ancient Babylon, the Bible talks about it's very patriarchal. We admit that. But that's because it was written within a culture that had a patriarchal structure, and it is what we still have, and that's what's being resisted. If the Bible represents the culture, it's not, I don't want to, the Bible is spiritual in its true meaning, which gets misinterpreted. But basically, I'm saying that the patriarch at times of transition becomes resisted. It's not so clear. I'm not super informed about the collapse of Babylon, but in the Bible they have stories of whores and general moral degradation. And in the Egyptian collapse, they have the 10 plagues, and what the 10 plagues are thought to represent are the polytheism. And each plague is supposedly, and it makes sense once you learn about it, is an attack on, not an attack, are representative of each god. And in the transition into Christianity, what you're doing basically is taking all these gods and consolidating them into one all-knowing God. And that was important in the journey to oneness. But in these plagues, they're natural events. You have Mother Nature rising up against society's morals. And how could Mother Nature, why would ancient people think Mother Nature would act on the behalf of God to help correct their moral values? And that's actually happening. But and I'll go into that in a sec. But after each plague, the Pharaoh's like, oh wow, this is God and he's doing this. And then he's like, okay, Moses, I'll give you this, and not giving his whole deal. And he's all worried. And then imagine the tragedy passes, and then a day goes by, and in his heart, and it says his heart hardens. So that's describing something bad happens. You're freaked out by it. And you're like, oh my God, I'm never going to do that again. And then a day goes by, and then you forget about it, and you're doing it again. And that's eloquently described in the Bible. So imagine in your life, this is a good example that came to head. So you drink alcohol and you get so drunk and you're just so sick and you're throwing up and you're throwing up and you spend a whole day throwing up. And then and you say, "Oh my God, I'm never drinking again." And tweet it, and then the next weekend comes and then you're out drinking again. So there's this motif of feeling the pain and punishment of something bad, time lapsing, and then forgetting the lesson that you learned. And that's what's going on right now. And can't get back to the feminism. Yeah, Mother Nature is in mythology and throughout religion during times of transition, and Mother Nature does rise up, and that's something I'll mention in a second. Roman Catholic and the fall of Rome. Well, take back the Roman Catholic. I'm not sure if that's actually the case, but the Roman Empire collapsed, and during the Roman Empire collapse and the lead up to that, there was a rise in divorce rate, and the statues themselves got more demasculated, and there's this whole rise of feminism. And in Camelia Pagila, that's Pagila, she's a academic. She's very informed about, this is her realm of knowledge of how the relationship between feminism, the signs of it historically within culture, and then how that relates to societal changes. And she's been very vocal about this, that there is a consistent pattern in which a culture becomes more feminine, and then a collapse happens. In the Roman Empire, you have people who actually believe the whole collapse was because of feminism, which is just so myopic, but characteristic of how we interpret things. And we're trying to put all the information in its context and having a perspective that doesn't rely on bias and ignorance just to maintain itself, because that's how the ego exists. It exists through cherry picking knowledge and holding on to that knowledge, and then feeling threatened and feared by knowledge that exists outside of it, when really the whole objective of this life is you become whole and integrate all knowledge, and you're really just resisting love. And that's a conversation that will be going a while. So the stages of, in the book of Fate of Empires, pioneer, go out, conquest, you got your world, you're setting up commerce, you're a growing nation, affluence, you're a rich nation, intellect, you become rich and you're settled, and you begin developing knowledge in ancient Greece and Rome, and you can Babylon, you can see that pattern. And that's how we came up with this pattern. This historian characterized into that all these groups of stages of development. And after after intellect comes decadence. And I have a quote from the book here on the screen describing the period of decadence, and the age of decadence will definitely ring a bell. So you have defensiveness, that's bias. You have pessimism. You have materialism. You have frivolity. I'm bad at reading. But frivolous. You have an specific. This is interesting. It says influx of foreigners, a weakening of religion, welfare state. And remember here, we're talking about Babylon and earlier, and we're talking about Egypt, Greece, Rome. This reads like a textbook of, this reads like a newspaper of what's happening right now. And it's so specifics. And you have influx of foreigners, welfare state, too long of a period of wealth and power, so that's getting complacent in your state of being, and that's obviously what's going on in the United States. They lost. And selfishness. Yeah, everyone is so fearful and concerned about themselves that they're not willing to help their neighbor. You have a love of money, a specifically love of money at these times, and there's a quote: the life histories of great states are amazingly similar, and are due to internal factors. Their falls are diverse because they are largely the result of external causes. So you have these core motifs involved in these collapses, and that is what is all those things are evident now, and they have all these different causes, and we kind of have a perfect storm of all of those. And that's not a random occurrence, and it's not a random coincidence that you have the historical Mayan long count calendar. It's not random that you have this rise of feminism. And I have another quote from a different page describing the same topic. Yep. And they list the government provides extensive welfare. Both irresponsible pleasure thinking and pessimism increase. Many foreign immigrants settle in the empire's capital. Rampant sexuality, an aversion to marriage in favor of living together, and increased divorce rate. It's very clear, and this is talking about throughout history, and that reads like an obvious description now. So if you're trying to make sense of what's going on in the world now, you got to account for that feminism factor, and because it goes back throughout history. And where so you yeah and if you're not thinking about that, your head is buried in the sand and you're afraid of your fears. But you don't have to be, because when you intentionally lift your head out of the sand, you find God. And that's what this is about. And so let's talk about the archetypes of feminism and why this particular period is more significant than the past periods. Well, I think it is, because I will describe that. So in the Bible, you have this prophecy in the book of Revelations of a beautiful woman on a monster. Appears to be, I'm not a fire breathing monster, because it mentioned that in the prophets as a fire breathing, breathes fire. And so a woman riding a monster, and that's what is a projection of this untime. So John in the book of Revelation, so he is projecting out a story from his unconscious. It's not something to be read as that's what he's seeing. It's like complete, he has a vision perfectly of, like you're reading a movie of the future. That's not how to think about it. The way to think about it is he's projecting out archetypes in the common themes underlying a period of collapse, in the particular period of collapse. And I'm going to think of it as rebirth into something new. The particular period of rebirth is the end period, the final one before what the prophesized rapture is referring to. And in my vision, because I have an insight into this because I had my own revelation in the process of writing out a prophecy from my memory. And in this prophecy, don't get freaked out by that word. That's just a message from God that comes from the unconscious. Like, you dream, you're not going to probably interpret it correctly, but that's, if you could make a prophecy out of that. So in my dream, there's a storm, there's a big storm coming, and people are running away. So right there you have the Mother Earth and the water. I'll mention water quick. So in climate change today, we have a fear of rising water. In the flood of Noah, you have water washing out the old and allowing the new. In baptism, you have water. In Jungian psychology, I read through his collected works, and he mentions this many times, is the maternal significance of water. So water is both the mother, it's both of death and rebirth. In Jesus, you have walking on water. And Jesus, the top of the walking on water is just that perfect connection to the eternal in being in. I don't want to say anything I'm not sure of. He is balancing the death and rebirth, walking on the water. If the water is the rebirth and he's walking on it, then he's in control of his mind, essentially. So also in my revelation, story that set off the supernatural experience, I was projecting out a metaphor of being a fish in water, and that was in the process. And so water is important. Like, it is, Jesus was a fish in metaphor. And in science today, we have a fear of climate change. And climate change, it's an interesting topic because it's so politicized, and there's so many errors and misleading ideas. I'm gonna bring up one of my stories. So climate change, I'm not saying what other side, I'm just pointing out the fact that it's bizarre. And I'm gonna read a passage here. I wrote an article on my Medium page. I called it "Zombie Wake Up: Metaphysics of Climate Change." I'm reading a passage. We are all aware of the doom and gloom of climate change. To put it in context, consider the other side of climate change. There's two sides to this debate. We all hear the doom and gloom. And here's some evidence. We are finding ways to rationalize and make conscious the projection of the devouring Mother Earth in the source of rebirth. So you have things like the ClimateGate emails, the Michael Mann, he had to file bankruptcy because he couldn't disprove his fraud. Like, if it wasn't fraud, you just give him your data and show him. Well, that's not the case. And tropical cyclones haven't increased in strength and number. The 97% consensus is not based on anything. It's not real. The models are all wrong. There's not any definitive link between CO2, but I don't want to go into that anymore. That's just annoying for everyone at this point. The point being that it's just in a bizarre science, and that's because it's gripped onto these archetypes in Mother Nature coming back to life for rebirth, just like Egypt and the plagues and Noah. And we're projecting that into science itself. And this is one mind. We live in one mind. And science isn't immune to culture. And that's what something like climate change shows, regardless of what you believe in it. But sea levels haven't actually increased their rate of increase. They're increasing, but then we freak out like it's, oh my God, it's just, we're all going to die. But when it really is just doing what it has been doing for thousands, for the last, before CO2, and temperatures have been much warmer in the past. But we can't, that's just a really good example of how the ego tries to maintain its perspective and keep out evidence that threaten it. And something like, so the climate change issue really does a good job for, on the ego's part, of maintaining a perspective of the external is focusing you, and you're at the mercy of other people messing up, and you're the victim, and the ego loves being a victim. And the idea of your future being ruined and out of your hands to no fault of your own, that's just like, yes, praise the Lord. I don't, my life's gonna be ruined and it's not my fault. I mean, that's like the best thing the ego could ever even want. So, and that's being projected into, but that's not the meaning of it. So the correct interpretation of such biased within science is that it goes with the feminism perspective in this period of rebirth. And don't think of it as doom and gloom. Think of it as an opportunity for you to awaken to your true self, because that's what it is. That's what God wants you to do. He wants you to wake up to the fact that you are his child, and that's the correct. Yeah. And so we have that. We have the rise of the feminism, and we have throughout the 20th and now 21st century. Now we have more women in universities than men. We have LGBT went from 1% to now near 8% since the beginning of the 20th century. And it's women's voting rights of the 20th century. And if you're not believing this, explain why that happened during the Roman collapse, and such similar things during Babylon, and why a historian of this describes the exact same thing. And then before all of that, in Egypt, you have the idea of plagues, washing out moral values. And then you also have the water motif that makes sense to now with the Noah. See, this is an unbiased perspective. That's not a fearless perspective. When I began this journey, for me to discover this stuff, which is really just giving myself over to God, I was a 3rd-year PhD student. I was going into my 3rd year, and everything, the world seemed so hopeless and despair. And I could see how I didn't understand the metaphysical aspect at that point, but I could see how the left and right debate were just driving everything in a direction out of control. It's an out of control tailspin, because everyone wasn't even thinking about the right issues. At that point, I thought individual improvement and ideas like individuation and taking back your shadow projections, which is a great way to think of it. And we project out our fears and what we love. And if you're projecting out your problems and you think anytime anyone thinks someone else is at fault, they're wrong every single time. there and that idea, the fact that that is true and all your problems are just problems you're creating in your mind, and that you have to solve them yourself through aligning with God's will. Like there's a big gap between that and where we are right now. I was thinking, not then I wasn't thinking of God, but I still knew of shadow projections and taking them back in a la Jordan Peterson type ideas. And what I did, if you can think of the exact opposite of a shooter who sees the world as a hopeless, and it's just so such an immense problem that he just takes it out. I saw that problem and I was like, what can I do to make it better? How can I utilize all my skills, all my knowledge, all my time, all my dedication? And I literally had the thought to myself back in August or September that I was going to commit my life to serving mankind. I was going to forgo things like relationships, friends, money. I thought that if I became successful in this, money would come, but I was going my own route. There's definitely no promise of jobs. So I was risking that. I was risking all that for doing the right thing and love. And I was creating something I'm still doing, Align You. Align You is aimed to help people turn their interest into a career in practical ways. And I put everything in that. I gave up everything. So when people try to not you don't understand this until I did what they say to do in the Jesus and the stories in the Bible, giving yourself for God's will. And that's selflessly trying to increase love and treat your neighbor how you like to be treated. And if everyone did that, obviously we wouldn't have these problems. But you can't know or think, you can't know that you're actually spreading love optimally until you have taken back. You don't have to be perfect and have like this ultimate control over your reality, because that's not the case. We're not trying to control our reality. We're just trying to align with God's will. But at least having the idea in your head that my reality is my doing, and if I'm really upset about something, or someone does me wrong, or I have any issue, if you can think to yourself that that's my fault, that's something what I think is reflected back to me from my reality, and know, like, okay, what do I have to learn from that today? How is this a learning opportunity? And taking all your issues as learning opportunities. Until you're doing that, it's not really practical to think that that person is really seeing clearly, because they're not seeing clearly if you're not taking responsibility for everything. And you can't create your reality until you take responsibility for everything. But the thing is, the ego likes to think, if you want to think of a law of attraction pseudoscience version in which you're just trying to get what you want and get rich and get girls and do that. That's not how it works. I'm not to say I know that's not impossible, because I do know our thoughts create our reality, but that's emptiness. That's meaningless. Ultimately, the perspective you will have is the eternal love perspective. And It's all our destinies to get back to go around these cycles of death and rebirth until we get back there to the eternal love. And there's an underlying pattern of reality. It's an underlying pattern of the psyche. And Jung started there's still more to go, but he started mapping out these archetypes, these motifs. And archetypes are a symbolic representation of instinct. And society goes on it's a hero's journey. We go on these hero's journeys. Hero's journeys are journeys of gaining knowledge from previously unknown and unconquered territory. And the stages of the hero's journey are call to adventure, supernatural aid, threshold guardian, beginning of the journey. You get helpers along the way, you get mentors, you get another helpers, and then you receive death and rebirth that's where you receive revelation. And that's when the hero goes to the underworld. And I received my revelation in jail, so that makes sense. And Jesus went to the underworld, and you have all these John the Baptist, I forgot his name, but he got put in jail. And Joseph in the Bible, he went to jail wrongly. And that happened to me because it's just this pattern of what happens, because you need to go. By the way, it was just a little bit. I didn't do it. Was nothing. Yeah, my mom came pick me up. It was all good. Because she thought I was going crazy. So, but that's where there's this idea of the underworld at the depths of hell. You receive the revelation, because at the depths of hell, you've overcome all your fears. You're there. You're at the bottom. You've seen the worst of it, and then you're like, "Hey, I came out of that." And then, upon reflection of that, yeah. So, the lesson of the grand lesson, in which we have many lessons, is to overcome your fears and realize ultimately your fears are illusions. They're meaningless. They're only based on ego's bias, and you have the phoenix burning away. So that's another thing I wanted to mention. In the book of Revelation, it's talked about as the prophets. I forget if it's a prophet or Jesus, but he breathed fire. That was in his revelation of what the prophets did. And in my own revelation, I had it burning away the home and burning away. What is this burning away? Why is in fire breathing dragon? You also have the motif of the fire breathing dragon guarding the treasure, and the treasure being at some horrible place. But why is it? That just means that the dragon burns away with truth your old self. And that's what, to become anew, you have to burn away the old. And the sacrifice, the wine and Jesus, you sacrifice yourself and you pour in the blood of Jesus. And there's this idea that you can't just take on Christ consciousness and take on all the good without also getting rid of the old. And that's the fear, and that's what the ego tries to maintain. You don't just get to get the reward and keep all your old crazy insane beliefs at the same time. You have to burn it away. So I'm kind of like a fire breathing dragon. Like, that's what I'm doing. I'm telling truth that for some people is gonna be painful, or just gonna get avoided altogether because they're scared of it and they don't know how to integrate it. But I'm saying that it doesn't matter what you do or who you are. There is a way to go about this, which is you're practically possible because you're just going accepting love and you're getting rid of the baggage and the junk. And getting rid of the junk, imagine like you're in a bad relationship or you're at a job that's unfulfilling and you're generally unsatisfied with your life. So what are you protecting it for anyway? Let it go and plan to do something better. And that's the way of God. Following your heart. Your heart is your guidance system back to God. And I mean that in the way not getting possessive and obsessed with an ex. No, your heart as in what you are interested in. You got to think back to what you liked when you were 4 years old, what you liked when you were growing up. Your interest is your path towards fulfillment, and that's your guidance system. Like I followed my heart in science and then of the mind and psychology, and you can read about that in my stories, in my experience of my divine supernatural experience. But your heart, and there's just a lot to go into, and I will talk about there's a lot to talk about, and that's that what I just gave is kind of an overview, and this will be an ongoing discussion of um the metaphysics of breaking down your ego and finding God. And I wanted to mention a couple other things to break down your egos and burn away your old self with love. So zombies are popular, Game of Thrones, Walking Dead. So if the reality is a reflection of your mind, then something like what's popular culture is going to be a reflection of that. And the interest in zombies is actually an interest of your unconscious trying to communicate to you your true self. And the idea is that we actually are like zombies trying to we're afraid of zombies, but the thing is what you're afraid of is what you are, what you dislike is what you are. And that's what zombies are. We are unconscious zombies. And the internet's a good one. Everyone can maybe you don't agree with the zombie things, but the internet is obviously making us interconnected in entirely new ways. And the theme behind all this is that unconsciously we're being guided around. Unconsciously we're being progressed towards returning to God. Whether we like it or not, we're going back to love, and you're going to have to deal with love for eternity, however much you may dislike that idea. And so the interconnectedness of the internet is a reflection of what's already getting put in place unconsciously. And my revelations, all of this is just recognizing, it's fundamentally just recognizing that the unconscious is controlling our actions at an unconscious level, and it's a step ahead of what we make the conscious connection, because our ego consciousness resists changes, but the changes keep happening towards God. And unconsciously we have negative bias too. But if you imagine the ego is a little ball existing within the totality, and you're on this, like the roller coaster analogy. So imagine you're on a roller coaster cart and you see like 2 yards ahead of you, and you think, all right, I'm going 2 yards ahead. But you don't realize that God is the entire roller coaster track, and it's already made. Like the whole roller coaster is done, and you're obsessing about this little piece in front of you, and you're just trying to go on this 3-yard piece, and your God's just like, wow, like, this ride's gonna be amazing. It's already finished. Like, and you're just so concerned about getting that next 2 tracks, this next 3 yards. And that's what we are. We are being guided on a blueprint, on a track that's giving us opportunities to wake up, whether we like it or not. And that's where we're going to right now. And in this roller coaster track of opportunity to wake up, we have built an infrastructure to connect with people across the world, to become one. And that's, if God is oneness and it's trying to guide us towards oneness, well, it makes sense to make a communication system across the world, and that's exactly what it has done. In Bitcoin, the decentralization of the monetary system, we are, as people, are really kind of at the mercy of our purchasing power. And when a government gets to, well, that's another aspect of it. So in 2008, we didn't really solve anything. The mortgage subprimes, they sold those off and packaged them as primes, but all we did was print off money and put it towards bailouts of these too big to fail companies. And that the fundamentals underlying the economy didn't change. So there's going to be a massive collapse of the economy, unlike we have seen since the Great Depression. And that's not just me saying that from prophecy. That's just basic economics. And the reason it gets ignored by the mainstream is because it brings up a lot in us. It brings up who we are, and it brings up the fact that, like, we like to hide from our problems. And it brings up the fact that it's just the ego trying to maintain this constant state of hope is just around the corner. The ego likes you to think that hope's just around the corner, and then you do this and you put it off, and then hope's going to be just around the corner. And it's always just out of reach until the whole thing falls apart. And that's the makings of what we're on. If you want to think about World War I and World War II, I'm going to think that was horrible. We would never do like that. The Nazis and all that. The truth is that we are the Nazis. We haven't dealt with that. We have not processed that. No one in popular culture, in the mainstream, we haven't integrated our shadows. And until you integrate your shadows, and your shadows is this Jungian term for the inferior aspects of yourself, and the whole area of psychoanalytics describes how overcoming your fears is the path towards God. And that's actually more important than what you love, overcoming your fears, because it makes everything love. And not necessarily you have to become good at. You don't have to become good at whatever you're bad at, whatever you're afraid of. You just have to stop letting it control you. Well, you still let it affect you, but just not letting it, accepting it. It's acceptance. Yeah. So we are on this track, and we have things like climate change being projected as science. We have all the way around culture, interest in zombies, UFOs. The circle has always been representative as an archetype of God, and it's fundamentally an archetype of God because it's the circle. God's the complete circle that's transcended all circles, and the circle represents the patterns we're on, and you just go around and around in circles until you get it. And ADHD and drug meds. So ADHD is an attempt to fit kids into the paradigm as it exists now. So you have these kids, and there's just no place for them in this world. They don't know. You have to be a certain way to succeed, because that certain way is what maintains the paradigm as it exists. And that's not we're headed towards expression of our true selves. That's fundamentally where we're going. I just realized I said the word fundamentally a lot. And that's also reflected in the Bible. And Jesus, he brought an eclectic group of tax collectors and whatever. And he didn't ask them to change. He just kept them themselves and integrated his teachings into being themselves. And that's also the idea of following your heart. And I'm going to definitely be talking about that in your future, about your heart, what you were born with, being interested in. That's your guidance system. It's not random. You are here and you're interested in things for a reason. And that's part of learning this whole vast realm of unconscious information and integrating it. And drug meds and we just basically sedate people for depression, although I'm not saying that in some cases and you have chemical imbalances, but even that, probably no. It's probably still a God thing, but because we don't know. If you think of a psychologist and a psychotherapist, you're not allowed. There are probably some that promote spirituality. You can't say to him, your depression, okay, you need to find God and make peace with God and integrate him into your life. You can't say that. So the fact that you can't say that creates an insane society, because that's the truth. And it's developing spiritually. Now, you don't have to use the word God, but developing spiritually is the answer, and that is the ultimate truth about life. And if you live in a society that can't say that and is based around ignoring such things because it doesn't fit into the paradigm, you're a little circle of an ego existing within God totality, and you're on a track, and there's a blueprint for you, but you turn your back on God. But God never turns your back on you. It has a plan for you, whether you like it or not. It's gonna welcome you back with open arms. And this is all a dream. In internalizing the fact that this is a dream, you never left God, and it's always inside of you. And in my experience, I know that I saw the light inside of you. I saw the Holy Spirit in everyone and we're all in this together, and it's inside of you. You want it. You're trying to help everyone else wake up. That's what we're doing here. And yeah, we'll get this eventually. But that was a lot. That was a good conversation, don't you think? Yeah. That's so what I covered today. I covered recap how the ego's resistance of change. It's not all it is doing is just resisting change. Just ego resists change. Bam. Okay, that's what it does. What do you have now? Do you like what you have now, or do you not like you have now? Okay, everything that brings up fears and anxieties in you is your ego resisting change. So put that in perspective. In past cycles, and you have your emotional attachments, mental and emotional attachments to your world as it exists now, based on your current beliefs. Well, it's just part of it. It's just there's practical ways to go about making the transition from your current world to the world now. And the feminism and the rise of Mother Nature, that's the fire breathing dragon, it burns away your old self. And Jesus did the same thing in the sacrifice. It was really just sacrificing his ego to transcend reality. Like, he died on a torturous cross, so he's obviously not afraid of anything. If he accepted that, like, it's not going to get any worse than that intentionally. And we need to be able to put all of human history into context. The dogmatic scientific perspective, scientific materialism perspective, only sustains itself through intentional ignorance of a vast realm of knowledge. And it likes to think science as it exists now, it's just a study of the ego. Within its realm, it can be extremely logical and everything fits together just so. It just invested in that. But it's just within a tiny realm. It's so, like, it's not, there's so much beyond, because the consciousness gives rise to something like the brain. And there's obviously, and if you're not even on that page, then there's a lot. And I talked about the idea of core beliefs. You have core beliefs that affect everything that comes after. So you have a light coming through a prism, and I use this conceptualization tool, and it is actually like something like this, but it's not exactly, of course. We'll get better conceptualization tools in the future. But me saying something like that, I'm setting myself up to be accepting to new information, whereas science in its dogmatic paradigms, it sets stiff boundaries of the boundary of consciousness arising from brain matter is just so grounded and stuck and old, and it doesn't, it just defending that irrationally, because that boundary line where it defends that is tied into culture. It's tied into, I have this core belief diagram, because that boundary line isn't just affecting science, it's affecting culture, it's affecting politics directly, but also kind of indirectly, but also pretty directly. And the external world affects us. It's always the out affecting in that perspective is completely backwards, and it's consciousness affects outwards. And at the most primary level, you have consciousness, this non-physical thing of beam of light coming in, beam of conscious energy, and then you have that, then the brain. And that's the fundamental, the most I say that word, but it's a good word, the primary, fundamental. That the correct interpretation is that gives rise to physical reality in the brain, not the physical reality gives rise, the external reality affects the brain, and then that gives rise to consciousness. That whole thing is the order is probably right, but it's actually backwards from that. And I have a book called Entangled Minds, and I've mentioned this in past podcasts, but they've actually done fMRI studies now where emotionally triggering images, and fMRI studies, emotionally charged images are just bring up stronger reactions, and because they bring up stronger reactions, it's easier to detect any change more generally. So what they found is that emotionally charged images, and they know this is what in this book written, this is because they definitely have more since then, but what they found was that the brain is anticipating the image to appear, and this is consistent with the many ESP studies in which emotionally charged images affects guessing. So something's going to happen, and then you try to guess what's going to happen, and your guessing is above chance, and that's odds, 1 in 500 million, whatever. And you have this astounding amount of evidence of consciousness being precognitive of what's going to happen, and you can't ignore that. And all I'm proposing is that the world is logical, and that you don't have to be in a fearful dogmatic ignorance to exist. And obviously that's like, oh, obviously that sounds good, and he's just saying that. But yeah, it's very, very obvious that this is good, and that's the dilemma. It's a completely opposite of how things seem to exist, and we live in a prism. It's a prison. And yeah, that's the world, and I hope to discover a new world with me. I hope you will stay tuned as I'm working through this, and I'm just waking up to all this, and I'm learning so much all the time, because there's an infinite vast realm of pure love, and there's a lot of religious traditions, and I mean, knowledge of people before, but I just have my role in this, and being a neuroscientist turned spiritually awoke person, and I don't know if awoke is a word. So it's fun. I'm doing what I love for the good reasons, and that's what it's all about, really. Following your heart for the right reasons, and that's what I'm doing. And I hope I have a plan to change the world, and that plan is to establish a unified message of spiritually inclined people. And so, what is that message? We need to get all the spiritually inclined people agree on a message that includes the fact that this is at a significant time period where we're transitioning, and we get them together, agree on a message, and then we get stronger, a more concentrated effort. And I'll talk about that. I'm reaching out to people to get that going. But yeah, that was a good episode of the Awakening You podcast. I'm thinking of dropping the Prophet and Friends portion, because I feel that's very ego triggery, in that they can't. There's just no, like, there's prophets are in the Bible, and that's that. They don't exist. But maybe I can bring that back once this gets going, because I do think there's a sense of, not a fearful urgency, but this is a golden opportunity kind of urgency, in which you're probably here to try to take advantage of this opportunity of waking up. And you just have, you have your lifetime, but still, it's not instant. Well, it could be instant, it could be a rapture type scenario, rapid mass awakening, because that's what I kind of think. Oh, it's heading with the internet and the singularity, and I think the rapture, and that's another aspect of the feminine. And Jesus came for his bride, and the male uniting with the female and making wholeness, and that's what we are doing as a collective, but at a cultural level, and becoming whole as a culture. And yeah, I do think about, what is the risen Christ? If it's someone who kind of pieces together this metaphysical puzzle, like, I don't know. Like, I don't know what that means, because because I know it's an archetype, but that's way beyond any of this right at the moment. But we need to come together and piece together all the information. Don't be afraid of information. Unify, love, and we will do this. It has to happen because that's just how the underlying pattern of the psyche works. Yeah, we'll see when it happens, but could be a long time, could be not a long time. And peace, awakening you. Hold on.